Next up, you have me. Thank you. So, thank you to the Commission, the Secretariat, the committee for today and inviting me to speak on some of the work we've been doing in Minnesota, evaluating coastal brook trout in our area of Lake Superior. A little bit of an outline. I'm going to give a pretty good detailed background of our North Shore streams on the Minnesota coast, historical coastal fishing that has occurred, habitat change through time, and contemporary water issues that we tend to see nowadays. We have a stream-based fall spawning electrofishing survey that we conduct. We've been doing that since 1997. I'll talk about our, as Eric mentioned, our tech committee protocol, shoreline electrofishing that we just got into in about 2018 or so. A unique survey that we do to address the limitations of those previous two surveys, and then there will be research sprinkled throughout the presentation today. So our North Shore streams on the Minnesota coast, we have bedrock geology and clay geology. And what we see are large waterfalls very close to the river mouths. So that leaves us with a very short segment of available spawning habitat for those fishes migrating out of Lake Superior into our tributaries. The habitat below these waterfalls is relatively poor when we talk about trout habitat, not only in substrate but also in thermal temperatures. So short segments of streams, that's what highlights Minnesota streams. Historical angling accounts, this comes from 1858. So this is pre-logging. We had our long-lived conifer forests intact. We had shade along all of our streams. We had good cold water from the headwaters to the mouth. We had streams teeming with brook trout. And this is the Knife River just north of Duluth, about 15 miles. One day, one gentleman had taken over 200 brook trout in a day. And this is consistent. What we hear from this time period is folks coming up in Mackinac skiffs from Duluth, fishing the river mouths and catching a lot of brook trout. So sourcing, population dynamics working, habitat is occupied by brook trout, and the excess fish are going out to Lake Superior. Historical stocking of brook trout is fairly amazing. This is 1894. This is the superintendent at the Federal Fish Hatchery in Duluth, expecting 100,000 brook trout from the Northville, Michigan hatchery, which were then stocked on Isle Royal, Minnesota, and Wisconsin waters. So a long history of stocking many various strains throughout time in Lake Superior Basin. Historical habitat degradation, I think this is the biggest one. The deforestation that had occurred, especially along the Minnesota shoreline, and then the subsequent fires that happened. The splash that was on the landscape post-deforestation. Thaddeus Server was a biologist for the Minnesota Fish and Game at the time. 1922, he did a survey of the upper rivers on the North Shore, and what he found was because of the deforestation, because of the fires that had came through and burned up the cold swamps, the once famous brook trout streams were no longer tenable as such, and that combined with overfishing of tourists, the only thing left to do with these warmer waters was to stock brown trout and smallmouth bass, which we did. But luckily, the resilience of the landscape kind of showed itself through time, and now we're back to a point where along the North Shore we have a lot of really good brook trout populations in our rivers again. He also says that the upper sections of these streams, again with that cold water essentially gone, they're seeing the brook trout having to move out to Lake Superior to find that good thermal cold water. Observations from 1939, this is from a warden supervisor up in Grand Marais, Minnesota. He's seeing, so this is 15 years after Thaddeus Server's survey, they're seeing a bunch of 3 to 4 pound brook trout swimming around in the Grand Marais Harbor. So, a lot of during the historic fishing times, a lot of brook trout because sourcing population dynamics, great habitat, things moving out. Now you're having fish moving out because of poor water temperatures. Some habitat changes seem to be more permanent. We see a conversion from the long-lived conifer forest to a short-lived aspen regeneration. A lot of beaver food on our landscape. What we see in our headwater rivers now, where we should be seeing the coldest waters, is we'll see beaver dam after beaver dam after beaver dam. Some temperature work that we had done through time. The graph on the right, top right, is above the beaver dams. The graph on the bottom is below the beaver dams. The blue area is within the thermal range of growth for brook trout. The yellow is stressful. Orange is we see is above the beaver dams, good cold water coming in, range of growth throughout the entire summer. This is from June 1 to September 30th, or the end of September. And then below the beaver dams, this is mean daily water temperature, right? So this isn't maximum. If this was maximum, you would see all of those points kind of shift upwards. So below the beaver dams, what we see is those water temperatures reaching the lethal range for brook trout many times throughout the summer. The water issues that we've been seeing recently, 2023 was a great example of this. We went into the winter, we set the snow record in Duluth. We're coming out of it thinking that, okay, aquifers are recharged, the cold water swamps are filled, it's going to be a good flow year. And then we go from May through the end of August with a 7.5 inch deficit in rainfall. So we go from great snowfall to essentially drought conditions throughout the summer. We hit the fall, Knife River system again here, we go from less than 0.1 cubic meters per second of flow, all the way up to greater than 226 cubic meters. So we're getting our rain, but we're getting it all at the same time. And this, on our North Shore streams, especially below the barrier, wreaks havoc on the habitat, and it wreaks havoc on the fishes that are in that habitat. So looking at our surveys that we've done through time, again, following our Lake Superior Technical Committee protocol for shoreline electrofishing, and we've been doing our stream-based fall spawning assessments once every 5 years, beginning in '97. And you can see from the Coastal Rehabilitation Plan from 2003, the Minnesota shoreline doesn't have any existing brook trout populations at that time, despite us finding brook trout below barriers in our rivers in the fall. And a lot of that is attributed to our perception at the time of, if it's not a big brook trout, it can't be a coaster. Right? If it's little, it's not a coaster, despite us seeing really good numbers of smaller fish below barriers. So our fall spawning survey, some limitations that we have there is flow. We're at the mercy of the river. If the water's high, it's murky, we can't see, we can't get in. Deep water, we miss fish. Our waterfall barriers, below the barriers, there's usually a really deep plunge pool that we cannot access with traditional gear. We know we're missing fish there as well. And then with low flow years, what we see is gravel bars forming from northeasters on Lake Superior, blocking off the river mouths. If we don't get a good flow event in the fall to push that gravel out, fish can't get in. We've used this survey through time to evaluate our management actions. 2006, we instituted a 1/20 inch minimum size limit below barriers. And then 2014, we reduced the above barrier bag limit from 10 brook trout down to 5 brook trout. And we see through time, the blue bars here are brook trout of all sizes. The black bars are, again, brook trout over 12 inches, where we're still kind of stuck in that. It's got to be a big brook trout to be a coaster. But you can see through time, the most recent in 2024 survey, we're moving that abundance of these fish up. Looking at our tech committee shoreline electrofishing protocol that we use, we just got into this in 2018. Grand Marais, Minnesota, Taconite Harbor, Silver Bay, and what we see is, especially in Grand Marais, Taconite Harbor, is the abundance of coaster brook trout. Now these are coaster brook trout that we're sampling in Lake Superior. Definition of a coaster is any brook trout that spends any portion of its life in Lake Superior. So if we caught them in Lake Superior, they're a coaster. We see good numbers. I mean, these are rivaling what folks see in Isle Royale or even more than what they see in Nippigan Bay. So now we have a new survey that we do every year. And this is just Grand Marais Harbor through time, starting in June 2019. This is just the number of fish. It's hard, my brain doesn't comprehend 0.1 fish per kilometer that much. So putting it into a numbers perspective helps me to understand how many fish are in the system. And I've got a fantastic crew. They're always asking questions, they always want to do more. We get reports from anglers that, hey, Grand Marais Harbor, we're getting reports of what appear to be brook trout spawning on the shoreline. So they went out in October of 2024, do some electrofishing surveys, and lo and behold, they found really good numbers of really good sized coaster brook trout spawning on the shoreline in Grand Marais Harbor. This appears to be the first time that we've documented that anywhere outside of Isle Royale. So that might be another survey we start doing as a fall shoreline electrofishing survey. So looking at the length frequency of all of the brook trout caught in all of the shoreline electrofishing surveys we've done, again, these are all coasters because they were sampled out in Lake Superior, we see that really nice plug of smaller fish from 200 to 300 millimeters, right? So looking back at that 1997 survey and the size of those fish, where we said, no, they're not coasters, we now have data and information telling us that size really doesn't matter for coaster brook trout. They don't have to be big to be a coaster. Troy Zorn and others, we contributed to this work in Minnesota, also confirmed this looking at stable isotopes, doing stable isotope work to confirm that brook trout caught below barriers were also using Lake Superior, thus them being coasters. And they found the probability of brook trout feeding in the nearshore prey in Lake Superior exceeded 50% for brook trout greater than 230 millimeters. So this helps us to kind of reframe how we think about brook trout and maybe brook trout management if the end goal is to create more coasters out there. So going back to the length frequency diagram of known coasters, we also know that we miss fish, right? That's a nice 21-inch, 530 some millimeter brook trout, but we know that there's bigger coasters out there. We know that because anglers tell us, right? We get pictures routinely of fish exceeding 20, 21. This is a beautiful 24-inch coaster brook trout caught on the Minnesota shoreline. But we just don't sample them, whether we're ineffective in those deep pools in our rivers where they are, or with the shoreline electrofishing, right? It's disjunct from the spawning survey, and there's a lot of area that you miss. There's a lot of room for those fish to avoid your electrofishing boat. So we know they exist. And we had just gotten through our steelhead genetics project, which was a really successful way of us recruiting anglers to collect steelhead scales for us to evaluate the genetics of a domesticated strain that we were stocking at the time and wild steelhead. So we already had a good plug of anglers kind of working towards the genetics work, and it was just a natural fit to then, begin the coaster genetics project. And we had already had, with Nadia's work and some of the work we did on looking above barriers, below barriers, and in lake, we did what we call coaster genetics 1.0. Nadia published stuff on that. It was just, now let's expand it, make it bigger, get more samples, get more rivers, and let's get anglers involved so we can make sure that we're sampling as many of those populations out there that we can. I got to give a huge shout out to Davin Brandt with Minnesota Steelheader. He was our marketing and branding guru. He made coaster genetics stickers. People love stickers. If you want to get a project going, just make a sticker, get them involved. You get a free sticker, come help. So Davin made a great sticker, reached out on social media, worked with Minnesota Trout Unlimited, Lake Superior Steelhead Association, other groups to really get anglers involved. We already had, again, the coaster genetics project, so we had drop boxes spread out along the North Shore where if anglers were out fishing, they got samples, grab a sample, throw it in the box. If you give an angler any reason not to submit a sample, they won't. So it is as easy as we could make it for them to collect samples and get those samples to us, we did. We had great kits that had a card in there to show them exactly what to do it, how to preserve your samples. We'd bring them in when they signed up for it. We'd train them on safe fish handling, safe sample collection. These were fin clips. So it was really a great way for, one, not only us to get free samples that we never would have gotten, but also for us to interact with our anglers. So angling for science was kind of the moniker we came up with it, and we didn't really have to incentivize participation. Folks wanted to do this. We just had to give them the opportunity. We also provide them with additional volunteer opportunities. So we would invite those folks that had signed up for the Coaster Genetics Project to come out sampling with us as we're doing our fall electrofishing surveys in the rivers. And again, it was a great way for us to engage with our stakeholders, show them what we do, because a lot of folks don't understand the amount of effort and work that we put in surveys all year long to do our fisheries management work. So this was a great way to interact with fishing stakeholders in our area. So how did our anglers do? 3 anglers collected over 51% of the samples out of 584, right? That old 10% of the anglers catch 90% of the fish seems to hold fairly true, right? But we had really good participation from a lot of anglers. They were able to fish essentially the entire year, where when we're doing our fall spawning survey, it's really only a few weeks in October. So they were collecting samples from April through November, the peak of those being, August, September, October, obviously, when those fish are staging and moving into the rivers to spawn. Anglers sampled more 12-plus inch brook trout in 6 years than the Minnesota DNR had done in 7 surveys over 30 years. So our perception that anglers can catch these fish in these deep pools, these areas that we can't collect them, held true. And we were always interested in, you know, like Chris said, are these large fish different either genetically or behaviorally? We don't know unless we get these fish, and using anglers was really the only way for us to get that top end size class of fish. They were also able to fish in those systems that we couldn't or we don't get many samples from. So you see the Baptism River, the Temperance River, the Cross, these are all areas with deep pools below waterfalls that we know their fish are there, we just can't get it. So another great example of using these anglers to collect samples that we never would have gotten otherwise. And looking at the genetics project in total, we had the Coaster Genetics Project 1.0. Coaster Genetics 2.0 is what Ben is going to talk about next, and I'll leave all the genetic stuff to him. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.